Final Fantasy has become far less of an event than it once was. Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, and 9 and 10, these were the cinematic showpieces for video games. Looking back, it can seem so simple now. The CGI itself, which was once so mind-blowing, is now basic. After Final Fantasy XI, when they switched to the online space, and then Final Fantasy XII was somewhat divisive with its politically oriented and British accented voice acting, there was a portion of the audience that began to repel from the changes that were happening within the Final Fantasy series. I find myself far less excited about each entry. I played Final Fantasy XV, that road trip brotherhood adventure, and it just felt like another open world game with some intriguing visuals to look at from time to time, but also quite flat and muddied in between. And it didn't feel worth the splendor that should be associated with something like a Final Fantasy. It didn't feel like it was earning the highs that it was reaching. I wasn't really excited about Final Fantasy XVI when I first heard about it. I kind of thought, okay, it's going to be another action-oriented Final Fantasy game. I'm more inclined toward what they're doing with Final Fantasy VII Remake, because at least that felt like they were just honing something that they had already toyed with in the past, improving on it, and making deviances just to grab your attention. I thought, okay, that's interesting. That's pretty cool. Thankfully, Final Fantasy XVI released a demo, and in that demo, we get access to the first 2 hours of the game. In getting a taste of that game, we're actually getting a sense of the sophistication undergirding the design here. There seems to be an attempt to go back to some of that cinematic flourish, back to that goal at least, definitely not the same style, the same way of accomplishing that flourish. It seems like Final Fantasy XVI is actually committing hard to many of the techniques of film, some of the ways in which film can go past direct dialogue and just telegraphing every little piece. Final Fantasy XVI is trying hard to take on some of the symbolism and beauty and continuous motifs that the visual medium of film can offer. With quiet from time to time, with space for the viewer to interpret as opposed to the viewer being told again and again when to feel what they're supposed to feel. Sometimes games can tell too much. Of course, it has the many peaks that are obvious in terms of how you're supposed to relate to these characters and what it is that they're going through. But there is also much foreshadowing. The characters earn the right to scream their sorrows. They experience tragic outcomes built from one vaulted storytelling pillar to another, and it feels as if you, the viewer, can follow each leap from point to point within the plot. Tension actually sits for a time. They're really being careful about how they're structuring this story. It feels like they're actually treating the viewer like they need to be thinking from moment to moment. And that is something different. From the moment that it starts, I notice choice, careful choice. The opening moments, the voiceover paraphrases a quote about the land you're entering. It was Moss the Chronicler who said that the land of Valistia is blessed in the light of the mother crystals. The world you're about to inhabit now elicited through the words of someone else you don't yet know. This is a kind of anticipation prior to witnessing what is being described as the title cards fade one to the next. There's a kind of trick that's been happening again and again. You see it in FromSoft games very often, where you have names attached to titles that hint at a much deeper lore. And so when you hear it was Moss the Chronicler who said, it's phrased as if the name is well known in this land's history. By assuming that you would know, it creates this sense of a deeper history than the moment you're just jumping into. It's something that you yourself are not familiar with, but it's clear that anyone in this space would be. And then, of course, immediately after, the quote that's being paraphrased about Moss the Chronicler introduces the first vocabulary for the game: mother crystals. Mother as in nurturing, warmth, in this case gifting light, and we are looking up at the light of the moon illuminating the dark peaks of mountain in the backdrop. Mother crystals are this scarce resource. So much of the pain to follow circles around this resource, and thus the opening of your sense of this world is in relation to this scarce resource, the landscape itself not yet seen. Notice how positive this first introduction to the mother crystals is. The land of Valistia is blessed in the light of the mother crystals. That it was this light which finally led our forebears out of the darkness. This is a positive angle contrasted first by the bits of ember floating upward. And this is the first hint of the counter to light's calm warmth, light's searing heat. Then the further contrast in the words that follow. Yet, what they saw in the light gave rise to temptation. Temptation that ever lures us back into the crystal shadow, and thus did our journey begin. What is desired is also destructive. Much like campfire on a cold night can be what destroys the grass and trees of life around it. We are introduced to the mother crystals much like those who probably found this resource in the first place, as this giver of light, this blessing onto the land. And then, just like in the time of the world, we then follow up with the realization of what that temptation brings. Once you have something desirable, it also now becomes something potentially destructive. That is where we begin, with that contrasting element of desire and destruction. And the title card for Final Fantasy XVI appears, a summation of the game's theme. We zoom out into the flames, and it's not a campfire beneath moonlight, which is what one might expect. It becomes a battle between gods, in this case, icons. These are creatures that elicit humble reverence out of a kind of deep fear. Literally, the creatures are icons in mythology. We see a phoenix, we see Shiva, we see various mythological beings that then get manifested as icons, and in this world they're aptly titled. This is the hook. This beginning thrills prior to the moments that it's going to slow down that are about to follow. The beginning of this game has a lot of slower paced elements, literally a meeting between government officials at some point, but they find a way to give us a taste of the struggle of the world and then give us a taste of the struggle to come with the beast that we're going to be fighting with. Enough of it so that we're hooked, and the music is steady to match the action until finally it culminates as the creatures break through into the ruins below. The flames of battle blend into the flames of a campfire in the eyes of our hero, at this point named Wyvern. The campfire we expected when we first saw the embers floating up in front of the moon now become the true campfire. Seeing all of this within his eyes suggests very much that what we were just controlling and just witnessing of seeing the phoenix fighting off the icon of fire, we were witnessing something that was being seen by this main character. It's quite a strange thing because they were flying through the air and slamming through the ground. It doesn't seem something likely for a character to see, but they emphasize the image of it in his eyes, as if as he's looking at the campfire, it's reminding him of this moment in the past of some significance. Foreshadowing for the sequence that follows this opening, wherein we return to his younger self and discover the link between himself and these creatures, but that moment hasn't arisen yet. And perhaps it pretends a kind of twist to come, the fact that all of this is captured in his eyes. Maybe his connection to this moment is more direct than we might expect. Now that we're around the campfire, there's a slow pan over two characters, Clive and another, each staring into the flames. We saw Clive's possible remembrances. The other seems to be focused on his own thoughts, perhaps another memory of flame. These characters have reason not to talk, but rather reason to sit, quiet, meditative, and remember. There's silence for a time. You could just hear light wind and footsteps. This silence is, of course, all the more palpable in contrast to what came only moments before with the otherwise booming soundtrack and flames spreading outward in violence. This is one of the first noticeable points in this opening to me, the fact that the game actually utilizes space and quiet. It's not story and characterization delivered solely by a script. This game has plenty of moments of apex emotion, but the player must also think while viewing, not merely digest what's given to them. As these characters sit, another character speaks. This character references Shiva's dominant as a target, only the dominant. Later, our kind does not question orders, we follow them. The dialogue, much like the initial narration at the start, treats these concepts as obvious. The viewer must piece together the relationship between terms. We're not told what dominant means. We're not told what mother crystals are. We're given these words to think about. Alongside mentioning Shiva's dominant, he refers to himself as our kind. Soon after saying that, Wyvern touches the scar on his face. Now you notice that each member of the party has a scar. To touch it in this way, it's as if for him, this is something new. It's not something that was always a part of him. A newness to his sense of self, in relation to this phrasing of our kind. More silence and the sound of steps. The other member at the campfire uses magic to kill the flames, and we've only had time to just think about the phrase our kind, so perhaps the link to our kind has something to do with the magic that was just used. Again, there's a use of silence and just thinking, allowing the viewer to just think about things a bit. Think about all this that's just been set up in just the first few moments of this game. It sets up the world, it gives you a sense of what the character's motivations and self-worth are. It gives you a sense of the overall conflict, and it foreshadows some of the action to come, and there's a grand sense of war overhead. After this sequence, we enter back into the light.
Focus, Wyvern. You are key to this mission's success.
Yes, Sergeant.
As he's told this, pieces of shattered struts from a seemingly ancient building lie integrated into the mountainside you traverse, a circular shape guiding the eye directly to the center you must walk through. He reminds him, focus, and you have the pinhole design focusing for you, your eyes and thoughts forward right down the center, as the sound of a battle horn passes as you pass through the initial arch. You and your compatriots witness an army in battle. We see that there's rudimentary weaponry, blades and axes, just one or two users of magic in the far background. We know that magic must be a rarity. Based on the kind of weaponry used, it seems that the technology is underdeveloped. This is our first glimpse of the iconic chocobos returning, but now in a new, violent setting, with blood spurting and spattering all around. Technology in this world seems bound to magic. It's almost like by giving the gift of magic, you remove the incentive to create. So these blue flames slung in boulders are like cannon blasts, and the dominants become like the warheads we fight for. Wyvern is like a witness right above the center line of battle, a neutral party. As Wyvern eyes a major stronghold in the distance, we then jump inside to a negotiation over an alliance of some sort. In this scene, there's a bit of subtle characterization for at least two of the characters that are going to play a large role in the story to follow. We have an unnamed woman who sees some magic used by being squeezed out of a crystal by a person in the room. And as soon as she sees it, she pulls out a pipe and uses magic from her fingertips to light a flame. Almost as if to say, while others need crystals, she can harness it through herself. A statement about the distinction between types of persons. Display of power in this moment. She speaks of the past success of those in the room. She says that these are the Dolmecs who drove back the Crusaders. This is a somewhat backhanded compliment because she's saying this to suggest to them, why do you need help? Doesn't your history suggest that you're able to accomplish this? By them not, that's a kind of insult to who they are now. She mentions the dominant that they're hoping to rely on, this kind of nuclear warhead in waiting, and we see him standing in the shadows. The dominant in the room then speaks. His actions display additional dominance. He rudely pushes the adamant official back down into his seat, then blows smoke in his face before mentioning that he himself is all that's left to solve the problem. This scene of officials in a room could have been dry politics, discussions of kings and queens and land and alliances, but instead it's being used as an opportunity to illustrate certain aspects of different characters that are going to matter going forward. It's one of those things that could have drowned out some of the suspense that had been built up already. But instead, this scene is adding to suspense because we're getting these little hints of conflict beneath the surface. Characters displaying worth to one another in undercutting ways. We learn as they meet in the hallway, this dominant and this woman who now her name is revealed to be Benedicta. They have a kind of tryst behind the scenes, something hidden from everyone else. Now together there's a suggestion of a deeper betrayal down the line. Perhaps this love story is going to have an additional risk involved. Maybe this is going to end tragically. Maybe this is going to lead to various problems with the alliance that we just witnessed. As soon as things could get boring or could get generic or could get obvious, we jump back out to Wyvern venturing forward through the mountainside, and a giant hand slams down and grips the side of the wall, much like the dominant himself had gripped the shoulder of the official in the Zemitra stronghold. There's a suggestion that it might be the same person who was in that room. And there's a gorgeous crystalline display across from the Titan as the music shifts to a separate ethereal theme. Shiva emerging. The army on the ground is nothing but fodder for the real deciding factor of war up above. They are all stuck beneath the footsteps and crashing powers of these icons, their deaths insignificant in place of what these creatures can bring. We see these creatures as the overpowering gods they are, and ourselves as insignificant fragments alongside the refuse of their destruction. When we go back to Wyvern and you see the crumbling mountain bits all around you as you venture forward, your smallness emphasized by the accidental quality of the destruction that's happening around you. From afar, the battle continues with yourself completely unnoticed. A boulder lands on a fellow mercenary, and it may be the one who was across from you at the campfire, the one who also seemed to have a flame in his eye, who perhaps was also reflecting on some past pain. And after being nearly killed by a falling pillar, you are dragged, once again seen through the eyes of Wyvern. Wyvern reaches out and just says, brother. Here there's a double meaning. The brother as in comrade in arms who just died, but also the brother whose memory you now slip into. You enter the backstory of this whole ordeal. Amidst the grand bombast of gods in battle, there is a deeper internal struggle that we're now going to have illustrated for us in a flashback of 13 summers prior. The first words you hear are, "Clive, get up, Clive," as you awaken from being knocked out, just like how you were knocked out into this dream memory in the first place. We see for the first time the younger brother of Clive, Joshua, saying,
"My brother always looks after me." Right?
This is of course more foreshadowing. It suggests a safety that Joshua feels with his older brother, and then of course what a tragedy if that were to be broken. By Joshua saying "my brother," we have clarification on the brother being referred to when Wyvern was knocked out. Their relationship is clear. Clive is capable in this space. He's training with the commander, and the commander is deeply impressed by his abilities. Clive is capable despite his genetic failure, because we begin to learn that he's not a dominant. He doesn't have, as his mother would say, the noble blood that is a sign of his excellence. His younger brother, Joshua, on the other hand, he's gifted with the honor of being a dominant. Though he is still young and small and seemingly meek, the expectation that surrounds this younger brother is that the protection of the kingdom rests on his shoulders. This is a pressure to grow into someone worth the position he's been granted. With that worth comes a degree of excess protection, perhaps. He says, "My shields look after me." Then he coughs, implying the opposite of what his title suggests. His body is otherwise weak, and his overprotection has left him fragile. After coughing, Clive says, "You shouldn't be outdoors." Ironically, the view of Joshua as fragile makes him a fragile thing to protect, thus increasing his delicacy over time. We have these polar opposites. This Clive who's destined for meager results, and yet through that low expectation pushes himself and tries harder and harder for excellence. And then we have Joshua who's destined for greatness, and yet through that fate, he then becomes overly protected, overly safe, and loses perhaps some of the conflict necessary for growth. Joshua, of course, seemingly knows this. At one point, Joshua says,
"They don't believe in me. They believe in the power of the dominant."
He seems to have doubts about himself. He sees how extraordinary his older brother is. He seems to appreciate the skills that his older brother has developed, and this probably puts in mind a sense of his own failings. When you're being told a story of how great you're going to be, and then you are witness to your own inexperience and your own inadequacy day to day, and then the brother who supposedly is amounting to nothing by birth is the one actually displaying his worth every moment he gets. That must be quite deteriorating for one's ego. Little Joshua is just watching and knowing that there's this power granted to him that has nothing to do with him. It's merely a story about him. But what does it matter? This is again setting up the kind of world we're entering into. This is a world of titles, a world of royalties. What you're born into becomes the boundaries by which you can maneuver. The expectations people bring, but also the protection you have, the luxury of life that you get to live. It is a caste system. The subtlety of choice in cinematography continues throughout all of this. We're experiencing this whole flashback, and we're getting this taste of the insecurity of the younger brother as a build-up to the explanation of how this opening began, how this Phoenix fight against the icon of fire was initiated, and what does this have to do with these two brothers. Again, it's still building to this moment because we know it has to come. We were already given a taste of it. What leads into the actual fight between the two icons is fantastically set up. others break into the castle, and there's truly danger here now. As the action rises toward the climax we know is to come, Clive tells Joshua, the fate of Rosario sits on the dominant shoulders. It is your duty to bear that burden. This is a reassurance given against Joshua's self-doubt. This is his destiny. He is supposed to be the one to protect this realm. We know that Joshua knows he's not ready. The last moment that Clive meets with Joshua, where Clive says, I must do my duty, you must do your duty too. You have to keep Father safe. The protection of Joshua's father becomes a test of his ability. To fail is to confirm his fears that he's not going to live up to the intentions or expectations that everyone has for him. Very soon after, Joshua sees his father in danger. Keep in mind his insecurity. He's been told by his brother twice that the fate of Rosario rests on his shoulders, that he has a duty to protect, that he needs to live up to these expectations. Joshua sees his father in danger and yells, "Stay back! I'm warning you." This is his moment, his chance to prove himself so deeply needed that he foolishly acts as if he can do anything of worth here. He can't protect his dad from these soldiers. He doesn't have the ability to. But it's his insecurity that makes him feel like he needs to say, "Stay back, I'm warning you." And that of course leads to the destruction that follows. His father protects him by turning and telling him to run. That is why the father dies. Because Joshua had doubts about himself and was trying to prove himself, was trying to live up to the expectations that his brother Clive had set up. The perfect build-up toward tragedy. For a tragedy to work, there has to be a kind of high lift of expectation crashing down into disappointment, where our hopes are shattered in some way. We get this with a young boy whose hopes get shattered by the reality of the situation. So because Joshua viewed this moment as a kind of test whether or not he can live up to his duty, he actually fails at protecting his own father by being the reason his father gets distracted. This is why his father dies. It seems like Joshua knows that he failed and that it's probably his fault. The blood splatters onto his face and it flashbacks to words from Clive about his duty. He begins to have a kind of panic attack as his breathing gets heavier and more relentless. Finally, he becomes the Phoenix. This is his moment. He reached the darkest point, and now he must live up to the expectations around him. The tragedy has begun to cascade a bit. Not only is Joshua to blame for his father's death, precisely because of the advice given by his older brother, and precisely because of all the expectations built around him as a protector, but now he actually is becoming a Phoenix. He's actually doing the thing he's supposed to do. And then what's going to follow is the battle that began this whole game. We return now to that battle at the start, to that grand spectacle, but now we know why. We know what Wyvern has to do with this spectacle. We know why he would be thinking about it and reflecting on it. He was there. He was, of course, on the ground watching as this was happening. He may have been more than just watching from afar. He may have been what brought the icon of fire there. He may have been the icon of fire. It's not yet explained, but it seems like Clive had something directly to do with what happens with that battle between the Phoenix and the icon of fire. It seems as if it was Clive who did it himself. This battle commences, and of course it was the first thing that we experience in this game is taking on the role of that Phoenix. And just like a lot of stories, the first thing you experience is the first thing you attach to. We are entwined with this young boy Joshua as a Phoenix. Despite the glorious music, despite the build-up, despite all of this expectation of success, Joshua as a Phoenix dies. This buildup is so tragic because not only do we see this young boy be deeply disappointed in himself, horrified by his father's brutal death, we also see his own grotesque finish at the hands of a beast. He dies slowly, brutally, and how worthless all the hopes were that had built up to this moment. Now we know Clive's place in the world. He seeks revenge against an enemy unknown. The enemy might be himself. This is why we were seeing that reflection upon this sequence at the very opening of the game. Finally, the title comes up, Final Fantasy XVI, and of course, the design in the midst of the logo is the battle between the Phoenix and the beast Ifrit, the icon of fire that kills him. This is going to be a grand story about the Mother Crystals, about light and darkness, about the contrasts within any realm of desire, and this is a story about a brother's loss, possibly his own regret. These opening 2 hours make this into a must-play experience because it feels like they're trying hard with this story. They're using every moment and not wasting it, and that is refreshing.